Well, hi everyone, it's Palm Sunday and I'm inside, as you can see. It's not quite as sunny as it has been when I've filmed for the last couple of Sundays. And I'm trying out a new toy today. Well, it's actually not new, it's old, I haven't used it before. Just here you can see a little lapel mic unit that I have for my camera. Trying it for the first time, so we'll see how it goes. So Palm Sunday. I reckon it's always fun to have a parade on Palm Sunday, have a bit of fun and make a point. But if we leave this story from Matthew's Gospel today, if we leave it at the parade, then we end up actually missing the point. This is how Reverend Professor Bill Loader puts it. Palm Sunday is also Passion Sunday, and the Palm Sunday passage moves us towards the Passion. It has its genesis in Jesus' own strategy to bring himself and his message to Jerusalem. This was much more than a public relations opportunity, not to be missed because of the concentration of people in Jerusalem over the Passover. Rather, it belongs to the body language of the message of the kingdom. It is an expression of hope for change. Just as Jesus reflected the Jewish roots of his passion for change by choosing 12 disciples, so also his march on Zion, or Jerusalem, reflects his people's vision that God would bring about a change beginning with Jerusalem. Bill Loader continues to affirm the vision of the kingdom and to live out its hopes in the present in action and symbol meant challenging existing structures of authority, both those of the temple leadership and those of Rome. This is the backdrop for the drama which follows. To journey with Jesus still means espousing a challenge to the powers which hold sway in our world and in the church. So it's Palm Sunday, last Sunday in Lent, the doorway to Holy Week, a week away from Easter Sunday, arguably the most important celebration on the church's calendar. By this time, churches around the world are gearing up for the biggest church week of the year. Some with services every day, even several times a day. Some with just a few, maybe on Maundy Thursday and then Good Friday. All leading up to the big one, Easter Sunday. It is at the same time usually an exhausting week, I can tell you that from some of my past congregations, but also exciting and a roller coaster of emotions and also a hive of activity. But this year is markedly different. Churches around the world are empty, will be empty on Easter Sunday, empty during this coming Holy Week. For many of us then, this week will be a lonely time, a sad time when we can't meet face to face with our friends and family in a church that will be a second home for many of us. We are being forced into hiding, as it were. How then does this story make sense for us this year? What can we make of it mostly incarcerated in our own homes? And that got me to thinking. The power of the day in the story from Matthew's Gospel was, of course, Rome. And I think because for much of the Gospel stories, for much of the Gospel stories, this truth often sits in the background and it only really comes to the fore in the Passion stories. And I think we tend to discount the influence of Rome in these Gospel times because it's not so clear throughout the rest of the Gospels. But let's be clear. Rome was everywhere. People were scared to move around, scared in their own towns, scared to leave their own homes. And maybe this year, that is our entry point into this story. Caught in our own homes, we can reflect on this story in light of our own fears and concerns. And not just our personal ones, but the deeply held fears and concerns of the community against a power that is so small as to be unseen, very unlike the might and power of Rome. But I want to stay with the actual story for the moment. Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, as Bill Loader suggests, is a confrontation to the powers of that day, but also this day too. Some scholars, like John Dominic Crossan, have suggested that as Jesus entered Jerusalem through one side of the city, Pontius Pilate entered the city from the other side. Now, whether this is actually the case doesn't matter. It offers a provocative image for us to consider. This theory suggests a polarising image for us, inviting us to consider, where do we stand and which one do we support? To journey with Jesus still means espousing a challenge to the powers which hold sway in our world and in the church. It's useful for us also to consider that Jerusalem was already packed for the holiday week, the week before the Passover celebration. Every man, his family and his dog tried to get to Jerusalem for this occasion because this was, and is, the big ticket item on the Jewish calendar, just as Easter is for us. So Jerusalem was crowded. It was real crowded. The Roman historian Josephus is recorded as claiming there were around 2.5 million people in Jerusalem at that time. Keep in mind, this was in the old walled city of Jerusalem, and if you've ever been there, you'll know it's not that big. It's not modern day Jerusalem by any means, and by comparison, modern day Jerusalem's population is around 900,000, not even 1 million. So even if this number of 2.5 million that Josephus claimed was not quite correct or exaggerated, even if it was half, it's still enormous amounts of people in that space and surrounds. But if he is correct, if it was 2.5 million people, then it was Squash City, and I shudder at the thought of how their toilets managed. So you can imagine that the Romans were on full alert, and we can reasonably assume that it was like this the entire week until the end of the Passover. Into this mass of humanity rode Jesus on the donkey, and possibly Pontius Pilate on a war horse, surrounded by soldiers, not merely for show but for protection too. And yet there's still more for us to consider here. Jan Richardson, a colleague from America, also an artist, I've mentioned her before, she's written these thoughts on this story from Matthew. She writes this: "This is the week we remember once again the moment when Jesus enters Jerusalem, moving with intention and deliberation into what waits for him there. In some respects, the final stretch of Jesus' path has been laid out for him. We know what will happen after he enters the city. We know the terrible road he will walk to the cross. Yet, Jesus is no helpless victim here, no passive participant. He's not dragged into Jerusalem, nor does he slink into the city on the sly. Jesus does not cease to make his own road as he chooses to walk with courage and clarity. Get up and do not be afraid, he told his disciples on the Mount of Transfiguration. And here he continues to take his own advice. Jan Richardson continues, This week invites us to consider how we are moving through our own journey, through Lent as well as through life. Are we allowing ourselves to be swept along by circumstances, travelling our road by default? Or are we seeking to walk with intention and discernment, creating our path with some measure of the courage and clarity by which Christ walked his, even in the midst of forces that may or do lie beyond our control? There is a time for stillness, for waiting for Christ as he makes his dancing way towards us. And there is a time to be in motion, to set out on a path knowing that although God is everywhere and always with us, we sometimes need a journey in order to meet God and ourselves anew. This is a week to ask, Jan writes, how do we meet God in motion? Well, I want to ask, how do we meet God in stillness? How do we meet God in the walls of our own home in which we might feel trapped? How do we meet God when we might be going just a little bit stir-crazy? Jan Richardson continues with her words, how do we move toward the one who is already making his way towards us? Whatever circumstances we may find ourselves in, how do we participate in creating our own path? What road is calling to us and has our name written on its stones? And more importantly, will we go? How we grapple with such questions in this time is extraordinarily unique. Most of us have never, and hopefully will never again, find ourselves, and our world in fact, in this position again. Nevertheless, here we are, confined to our homes, under the rule of an invisible power, contemplating a parade. But after the Jesus is coming, pave the way with branches bit, there's even more. There is the picking up of the branches and the cloaks, putting them in lost property and hoping the owners will claim them. Then there is the last bit of that stony road to walk. A walk that does not have a pretty end, at least not at first. So, get up. Take that next step. Wash your hands. Do the next right thing. And don't be afraid. Jesus is coming. Hosanna. Amen.